So welcome, Tiffany, to dating, disability, and relationships. I just told everyone how much I love the Anti-Ableist Manifesto, and I'm so glad that you're here. And even though I just told everyone how great you and your work are, can you tell us a little about yourself?
Sure, and thank you so much for having me on. As you mentioned, I'm the author of the Anti-Ableist Manifesto, Smashing Stereotypes, Forging Change, and Building a Disability Inclusive World, which has been out in the world for about a year, which is really exciting. Outside of that, I am a disability advocate and do that through being the founder of Diversability, which is a community focused on advancing disability leadership and building disability power. Social media advocacy. I created something called the Anti-Ableism series on social media, and I also run a micro grant called the Awesome Foundation Disability Chapter. So essentially, for me, it's really thinking through what are ways that we can increase access and opportunity in the disability community, whether it's through economic empowerment or civic engagement. And so I come into this space based off of my own personal lived experience. When I was 9, I was involved in a car accident where unfortunately my dad passed away, and I acquired a handful of injuries and disabilities that have really inspired a lot of why I do what I do today.
That's wonderful, and you do so much between the book, Diversability, you're a peer Olympian. Do I have that correct?
Oh yeah, yeah. So this year, I call that pillar of my disability advocacy joy. So this year I started paraclimbing, which is top rope climbing for adaptive athletes, and am lucky enough to get to represent USA at a couple of international competitions. And I just returned back from the World Championships.
Wonderful. So what was that like?
It was, I didn't do as well as I would have liked, but I'm also, the paraclimbing journey is really tied more toward a very personal journey of exploring the things that 9-year-old Tiffany loved doing and re-exploring them in this 30-something-year-old body in my own way today. So I started biking again, which was something I did a lot as a kid. I entered a pageant. Um, uh, and then yeah, I have so many memories of being at friends' birthday parties at rock climbing gyms before. I call these during my pre-disabled times before I became disabled. And so in a lot of ways, just getting back on the wall was just really about fun. And it just so happened that after I had started climbing, another friend within the adaptive climbing community sent me a link to the national championships. And they were also in California, which is where I am. So I said, you know what? I'm just going to show up. Again, I didn't do that well. I tied for last at the national championships, understandably so. But it was actually cool being there because there were a couple people there who had read my book. And so they were like, oh, we had no idea that Tiffany was a climber, but we're so excited about all the other advocacy work and her being able to use her platform to increase visibility for this sport. So I think about, you know, not only my own personal performance, but kind of the growth of paraclimbing as a Paralympic sport. It's going to be introduced on the Paralympic level in 2028 in Los Angeles, which is where I'm based. So, so yeah, it's just really cool to be a part of this movement. And everyone in the paraclimbing community is so welcoming and warm and supportive. And so it's been really fun. I will say it's a 16-hour time difference between Los Angeles and Seoul, South Korea, which is where the World Championships were. So not only is there a recovery period on the way there, there's a recovery period
I
on the way back.
I But the important thing was you showed up.
Yes,
You
yes.
did it.
And that's actually a big theme from the Anti-Ableist Manifesto too, is like sometimes the hardest part is just showing up. And I want to give compassion and grace if you can't. We experience a lot of barriers that make it difficult for us to show up. But sometimes us being there, even if it is difficult or we experience access friction or ableism in those spaces, hopefully we can make a little bit of change to move the needle forward so that the next time whoever comes, hopefully either we pave the path or follow in the footsteps of someone else who had to experience things. And hopefully, and again I talk about this in the book, we can come to a place where we're living in an accessibility first culture where we can show up to a space and experience what Mia Mingus calls access intimacy, right? This idea that we don't have to ask for permission to show up.
Right, right. Well, on that note, let me launch into a couple general questions. As the founder of Diversability, you have built the incredible community of over 80,000 people. I have that right. And you focus on disability, pride, and empowerment. And what role does disability pride play in showing up confidently in the dating world?
Ooh, I will say I have been on one other dating related podcast, and this actually is a question that I get pretty frequently because, I think not only do we experience a lot of ableism in dating, but we also have a lot of internalized ableism to unlearn as well around understanding that we are whole and valuable and worthy of intimate and romantic partnership if that is something that we desire. So, to me, disability pride is the way that we as disabled people essentially combat ableism. I say the best way for us as disabled people to combat ableism is through disability pride and disabled joy, just showing up as the fullest embodiment of who we are and experiencing life again in its full embodiment. But how does that translate into how we show up confidently in dating? One of my takeaways from being on another disability on another dating podcast, and I think I was on that podcast. It was 2022, so it was 3 years ago. And I, was at a different phase of my own dating experience. And what I realized was that disability pride meant not feeling insecure in my disabled body. And a part of where I feel like we experience moments of not having confidence is when we don't feel secure in who we are, right? So, uh, whether our disability status or our disability story plays a role in that or not, uh, will like I guess the way I think about it is let me do some self reflection on all of the areas where I might feel insecure. Maybe my disability story is part of that, and maybe it's not. But one of the things I realized is the way I show up confidently in dating is feeling the most secure in myself, in all parts of myself. Right. And so I have stories from long time ago, probably over 10 years ago, where I would wait until maybe the third or fourth date to share more about my disability story. Where now in dating profiles, you look at the work that I do, I ask people to look at my work, or I have pictures that show very prominently me wearing my wrist splint on my injured arm, on my paralyzed arm, which I do sometimes. Uh, so yeah, I think disability pride is just part of that journey of unlearning our own internalized ableism, of how we know that we're again valuable and worthy of partnership if that's something that we want.
I'm sure you don't know that about me, but I spent many years struggling with what I call sexual ableism about people with disabilities and dating in relationships, and how I had internalized that. And finally, I got to a point where on the first date, I would say, okay, so how are you doing with me having a disability? And the first time I gathered up the courage and to say that, my date cried and said, I'm I'm really uncomfortable. And I had a moment where I thought, okay, I will crawl under the table because it's too hard. But I took a deep breath and said, well, this is who I am. And this is why I would make a good partner for someone. And long story short, I've been married to that date for nearly 20 years now. So it took, I say it took me just the breaking out of that feeling like I couldn't show my pride. And then putting it on the forefront that really changed everything for me in dating.
That's beautiful. Yeah, and I think about I also think about the emotional weight that maybe we put on ourselves around being disabled. And it makes me think about how, more recently in dating, I'll show up at a date and if they haven't looked at the photos closely, they did not notice the that I wear a wrist splint or that my arm is paralyzed, and they'll say, "Oh, like you're wearing a wrist splint or something." And I go, "Yes, I paralyzed my arm in a car accident a really long time ago. It doesn't hurt." And so even in that phrase in itself, there's no emotional weight on it. And so if I'm not making it a big deal, hopefully my partner won't make it a big deal either. But I will say I have definitely been in instances as well where I have been on a date and they have experienced discomfort with dating someone who has a disability. And uh, dating is a place where everyone has preferences, and I don't feel like I need to prove to someone that I am going to be a good partner to them, right? And I think this is part of the showing up confidently process as well, is just knowing, like, you are a wonderful case study of this, that you know and it was the date who said that they were uncomfortable, and now you've been married for 20 years.
But
Yeah,
yeah,
so that's a beautiful story, right? And so yeah, I think and I mean, dating has changed so much in the last, I don't know, 15 years since I've been I've been active in this space. And I think one thing that's interesting for me is that as an Asian woman, we are hypersexualized, right? And then as a disabled person, we are desexualized. So I feel like I kind of sit in this oscillation between being over sexualized and then being desexualized based on, which aspect of intersectionality you end up leaning into.
right, right, yeah. You have had an incredible career journey. You have worked at Goldman Sachs, you founded Diversability, you're a content creator with millions of views. Can you share a little about how your own relationship with disability has evolved and how that has influenced your personal journey in dating and relationships?
Yeah, such a good question. So this year will mark 28 years since I became disabled. And I
Mhm.
do also think it is important for me to name that I'm someone who acquired my disability. And for those of us who acquired our disabilities or have disabilities that are either dynamic or become progressive over time, we may experience some form of grief around the way our body once was, the way it is now. And so my grief period, so for about 12 years after I became disabled, I didn't tell anyone about it. In some ways, I became disabled when I was in elementary school. And so I'm growing up with the same group of kids, elementary school, middle school, high school. So I don't really have to explain myself to anyone, right? That's kind of like the cop out. But what also ended up happening was I didn't learn to become my own self advocate, right? I didn't learn how to use my voice. And also potentially influenced by my own cultural background of being the daughter of Asian immigrants, there may have been some lingering shame around what it meant to exist in a disabled body. So I didn't tell anyone about the car accident. I told people my dad was away on a trip. I would wear long sleeves all the time to hide my arm. And so that I kind of existed in that space until I was a senior in college. And in college, I think college to me felt like, actually, I will relay this over to relationships too. College and relationships, it just felt like the best playground for growth. So my university environment, I will also share, I didn't identify as Taiwanese American or Asian American or Asian until I was 18. I had also grown up in an environment where I wasn't surrounded by a lot of other Asian people, so there wasn't really anyone to share my culture with. And so when you are so isolated like that, it's hard to build community. So when I was in college, I built my first Taiwanese American community. And that's actually where I got the inspiration to start a disability community. But one thing I noticed, so I will say 1997 is when I became disabled, or my first disability origin story. I like to think that many of us within the disability community have what's called a second disability origin story, which is a turning point or a defining moment or a long period of time where a disabled person decides to take pride, ownership, acceptance, or even at a baseline level, acknowledgement that our disability does impact the way we move throughout our lives. So my second disability origin story, I want to say, started as that senior in college in 2009. And since 2009, I think I have been on that disability pride journey, which is I acknowledge that I have internalized shame and internalized ableism around what it means to be disabled, around, I didn't, I call myself a late bloomer. I don't think I went on a first date when I was 23. Um, and maybe, I do reflect on that of this college environment being your playground for growth. It was not a playground for growth for dating for me. It was, and potentially, and now looking back on it and saying it out loud, potentially that growth area for me was discovering who I was becoming and grappling with different aspects of my identity and if I could feel pride in them. And a lot of what we do at Diversability is what I call this shame to pride transformation around a disability identity. So 2009, which is 16 years ago, started my disability pride journey. And I will say one of the things I realized, so 2009 until 2019, 2019 was another turning point for me where I started to acknowledge that not only was I doing a lot of work around owning my disability story, but how can I also acknowledge the grief of the loss of childhood innocence, acknowledging that part of this disability story was also a kid who experienced things that I hope other kids don't have to experience. And so that kind of started that journey of, okay, let me think about the things 9-year-old Tiffany would have wanted to do. And through starting in that 2019 timeframe, it made me realize, yes, I had confidence in my story, but I didn't have confidence in the way that my hand looked. So I even just posted a photo recently where I reunited with a friend that I used to work with in 2009. She lives in Seoul, South Korea. I actually just saw her when I was in South Korea for the World Championships. And I found an old photo of us from 2017. And I noticed in the photo I'm hiding my arm behind my hip. And I had expertly learned how to do that. And even if you go back and you look at my old Instagram photos, I'm hiding my arm behind someone or under a table or, and so it was like, okay, I'm doing this work and I'm visible and I can tell you this story about the car accident, but do I feel comfortable and do I feel accepting of the physical manifestation of my disability? I have muscle atrophy on my arm, arms are different lengths. And in some ways, climbing, it's a sport, it's a spectator sport. People are watching you. And I even remember, now we're in 2025, how uncomfortable I felt and still feel having people watch me climb. Part of how I think I'm unlearning that is the emergence of TikTok in 2020. I started putting my arm, and that was video, right? This was before you had AI video. So I was showing people my hand, and people were making comments about it. And I was like, this is how my hand looks, right? And with climbing, this is how I climb. It looks different than how you may climb, but I'm having a lot of fun. I'm reconnecting with my younger self, right? And how can I right? It's like, how can I marry the story, which I feel like I've become really comfortable in storytelling with just existing in a disabled body, which again has its hard moments and also has its moments of this is the way my hand works, this is the way my arm is, and making space for the gentleness and grace and compassion around grief, but also just the awe that I have that in this one body, all of the things I've been able to do. So I think that's been a little bit of my journey. I mean, I feel like I hadn't thought about sexual ableism, but it is something, even if I just think about bodies. And I think Brene Brown has said that, like, the number one area of shame for women, disability status or not, is body image, right? So if you layer on physical disability on top of that, that will, it again, I guess it's kind of where we see like the sexism and ableism interplay. Uh, and so again, I guess over the last 5 or 6 years, I have been on this journey of like maybe another disability pride journey of just owning that this is the body that I'm in. And that's how it shows up in dating.
Yes, I think when we can truly own that, whether you're disabled or not, that is so freeing.
And
You
I think that social media has actually played a huge role in the acceleration of body acceptance because now we're seeing so many different bodies just existing on the internet to show us that, okay, if the mainstream media has showed us this certain body is the ideal, now we have so many more examples of that. And hopefully, those content creators, there's research out there that shows that disability inclusive content is smart business. We have to wait for media and advertising to catch up, which has very low disability representation. But if we're seeing this on this level of social media content, my hope is that it's only just a matter of time before we start, and we've already started to see the billboards, featuring people of all different types of bodies.
and I love how in your book you have a chapter, I believe, on diversifying your feet, and which, as you say that about social media changing how we view bodies, I thought, yes, when I get on Instagram, I have some very diverse seen of people with different abilities and different bodies. And the overall message that I'm getting is it's all good, it's all acceptable.
And I will also acknowledge too, it's a journey. I will say now as an athlete, I have to think about my body in a different way. Um, and and I will acknowledge, even in full transparency and vulnerability as we record this, I don't know, and it's actually not even related to my physical disability. I don't know if I feel full confidence in my body where it is now. But I am competing in a sport, And so part of that journey is also thinking about body and how to get it in a place that helps me perform best. And that has been, yeah, I mean, I was talking to my coach yesterday, and I digress a little bit, how there is a transition where you go from a climber to a competitor. And I I'm doing my own reflection on if that is a journey I want to go through, because you have so much more scrutiny on your body when you become a competitor. And as someone who has had an evolving relationship with my own body, what do I want that to look like? And how do I still maintain some levels of joy as I become my own version of a competitor?
Right, right. Let's talk for a minute about the title of your book, The Anti-Ableist Manifesto, which is, you gotta read it. I'm just saying to everyone, you gotta read it because it's way beyond disability awareness. And I think as a disabled person, we don't talk nearly enough about ableism in the society. So anything that can bring that up, I welcome. One of my questions for you, Tiffany, is what might it mean to be anti-ableist in romantic relationships?
Ooh. So the definition of ableism that I use is when we devalue someone based on the way their body and or mind works. And I will also acknowledge that the first time the term ableism was ever used was 1981. And I was born in the 1980s, and I don't think I'm that old. And so I also just want to acknowledge that, and again, this is me having some grace and compassion, is that we haven't had language to experience or to explain the type of devaluing that we as disabled people have experienced until 40 years ago. So it's also okay if these terms are newer, or maybe we're still trying to figure out how we have a conversation around it. So, anti-ableism is what are the strategies and practices and policies, processes I'm putting in place where I'm actively not devaluing someone based on the way their body and or mind works. So, when we translate to anti-ableism in dating, it's again saying, where might I be devaluing someone as a potential partner based on their disability status? And what can I actively do to combat that? And interestingly enough, I will share that every single romantic partner that I have had has had a disability, whether it's ADHD or anxiety or BPD, and those are all mental health conditions or a type of neurodivergence, and I think part of the disability conversation is expanding and understanding that the majority of disabilities are not apparent. And so there are so many more of us who have disabilities than we might know. That's not to say that everyone you date is going to have a disability, but it's also to say that, you know, and I actually feel as I reflect that some of my best allies in life have been these romantic partners because they have become so intimate, they become so intimately witness to my daily life. And so even one example is if I bring whether it's a friend or romantic partner with me to an event, they will see how many times I get asked what happened to my arm if I'm wearing my wrist splint, right? And a lot of times they will comment, "Oh, I didn't realize that you have to ask that question, answer that question, and you get asked that question over and over again," which is a type of microaggression, right? Or could become a type of microaggression. So yeah, anti-ableism to me in dating is let me and I even think about I remember it must have been like 10 years ago. I was grabbing dinner with a couple of my girlfriends, and I was in my first romantic relationship at the time, and I was like, this guy is so great. He cuts my meat when we go out and we eat at a steak dinner. And in some ways I see you smiled when I said that. I even think about how that became a baseline for me, right? Where anti-ableism in dating is hopefully that's not, I mean, that's not necessarily an expectation, but that's just part of that access intimacy that I'm looking for in a partner, where maybe you have the situational awareness to think about and be proactive of what my access needs are when we go out on a date, right? So I guess I've just shared like two small examples of where we can be anti-ableist in dating, where the first is if you is to like do some reflecting on where you might be devaluing disabled bodies and our minds when you are thinking about who is a potential partner. But then if you are dating someone who is disabled, are you exerting that level of care around how you are organizing dates or yeah. I don't know if you have anything as kind of like an expert in the space that you'd want to add to this conversation of what it might look like to be anti-ableist in dating.
Well, what I wanted to say is I run a program called Dating Made Easier, and it's a coaching and support program for people who are dating, trying to date, and we continually address the social and emotional issues that come with ableism in dating. And what I'm curious, I realize I might be putting you on the spot, but I was fascinated by, and to be honest, this was the education for me when I read in your book about ableist microaggressions and how you break that down into micro insults, micro, I'm reading my handwriting here, invalidations, micro assaults, and casual ableism. I, it's a very detailed person. I loved that breakdown. I thought that could be very helpful when I'm coaching people. Can you give us an example of how this would look in dating?
Yeah, now you're like, "Oh, let me find this in the book."
Oh, I can tell you, because I have the book open to it. But it's
Oh, I
easier.
like I like that you have all those little sticky notes.
Yeah, so
I
this is
I will
telling me.
I will say, yeah, we're coming on a year. We're coming on a year of the book, and when it first came out, I could tell you like the exact page because I had
Right.
narrated the audiobook as well and did so many rounds of edits. But yeah, so how this shows up in dating. So micro, can you here actually, why don't I can you edit this part out or this just gets part of it?
I can edit out whatever you want.
Okay, let me look this up.
And then, sorry to put you on to that.
That's okay.
But
I will say probably a year ago when I did this, I I had it all. Oh, I see it. Oh, okay. It says here, let me find it.
and if you just want to give some one example, that would be fine.
Yes. So I mean even and for those who are listening to this, and if you have a copy of the book, it's on page 52. Um, but a micro invalidation would be something like, "Oh, I don't see you as disabled," or "You don't look disabled." Um, and then a micro insult, I mean, a micro insult would be, "Oh, but you're so beautiful." You know, I actually get something like that in dating, which actually could be a combination of a micro insult and a micro invalidation, which is kind of like erasing my disability experience by through some level of what people call whether it's pretty privilege or attractiveness privilege, right? Uh, or, you know, telling someone that they speak really articulately or really well for a disabled person, right? It's like adding that little classifier at the end. Um, and then I could also see potentially microaggressions show up in dating around, you know, not having a level of care for someone's access needs. And and this is something I do think about too is you could be in a situation where two people might have conflicting access needs. Maybe one person needs some time to process information while someone else uh, whether I would consider myself an anxious person, would prefer to talk about a situation right away, right? And I think this is all just part I don't want to diminish it to say this is part of the learning journey of potentially finding that partner, but it also kind of reminds me of, you know, how the five love languages have become kind of popularized and understanding that you have like a giving love language and receiving love language that might be different, but also having a level of care to understand what your partner's love language is, which might be a little bit different from how you operate as well. So to me, that's why I say like dating and relationships outside of college feels like another playground for growth, right? Where you are learning about someone and figuring out how your puzzle pieces potentially fit together.
Right, right. I'm just trying to edit that up. I have so many questions and we're at 2:13, so let me take a moment to just look at my most important questions.
One thing I also want to acknowledge too is as I was finishing up the manuscript for the Anti-Ableist Manifesto, I realized I do have a chapter about being in community with disabled people, not in a romantic sense. And I remember talking to my editor about if we should add a chapter on dating and relationships because I actually do think we see a lot of ableism show up in that space. I believe it was a couple years ago. I mean, and as part of the anti-ableism series, I think I have talked about ableism. You know, I think there was an example where someone's partner was chronically ill and they didn't want to take care of them or something like that. It was like an advice column. I don't know if you remember, I think maybe in the New York Times. And so as we thought about it, the book was already a third longer than we had anticipated it being. And I look around, and even on my bookshelf, there are books that have come out in the last couple of years that are about disability and dating. There's
Mm.
one called Interabled from Shane and Hannah Burkaw. There's one called How to Be Dateable. No, that's a different book. There is a book called Dateable, which is by Jessica Slice, and her co-author's name is escaping me, which is also about disability and dating. And so the hope is that, okay, I acknowledge, and there are small parts throughout the book. So one microaggression that disabled people who have physical disabilities get is if they can have sex, right? It's a pretty intrusive
All
question
the time.
all the
All
time.
the
So
time.
so I so I have examples throughout the book that I try to, or even an example of internalized ableism of a person thinking that they don't deserve to be or to have a romantic relationship. So it's sprinkled throughout. It didn't get its own dedicated chapter, but my hope is that the Anti-Ableist Manifesto exists as a resource alongside a lot of other books by disabled authors that you can tap into, especially if dating and relationships is something that is of interest to you. And there are a lot of books on dating and relationships that are by non-disabled authors as well that you can get a lot of information out of.
Right, right, right. And I do see it. I mean, I've been working in the field for 35 years. So I see how it's changed in those 35 years. But also because I do work with individuals, I continue to hear first-hand accounts of people really bumping up against ableism and dating and relationships. And one primary one is just not being seen. And I wonder if you have any advice for people who deal with that. Like the people I work with who are wheelchair users, they will frequently say, yeah, they've seen the chair, but not me.
Mm, yeah. Uh, I guess for me, this comes back to the importance of community. And as someone, so I am single right now, so I'm currently going through it. And I remind myself, as someone who desires a monogamous relationship, right? You just need one. So even, and I try, so one is community and just making sure that you have a support system in place, that you're not putting too much weight on having a romantic relationship fill a void that you think you have. Like you're already whole. This is where I've also learned to lean into my friends. I actually used to be part of a couple of Facebook groups that were specifically just single people ranting or sharing their experiences and frustration with dating. And it was helpful to have that space because I knew I wasn't alone, right? So part of the being seen is just knowing that you're not alone too, but also not placing as much weight on other people's opinions. I heard someone call this FOPO, fear of people's opinions. Uh, and and so just like having that community, and I will say back in 2021, I did notice that I had a lot of anxious tendencies come up in dating for me. I would try to force intimacy or force vulnerability very quickly, or I would weaponize vulnerability in some ways where I would hope someone would choose me or you would create some kind of trauma bond. And I would talk to my therapist about that, and we would come up with ways to manage that or even just name that that was showing up, right? So I just felt really grateful that at that particular point in time, I had this Facebook group where I could just talk about my experiences or know that I was not alone. I had other single friends I could text or just give them updates on my dating life. And I also had just professional mental health support around some of the harder, softer moments of trying to navigate dating as a disabled person, understanding that a lot of people may not have experience dating someone like me or like us. And the community that I've built at Diversability also meant I could keep coming back into a disability centered community as well if I needed to. So I just wanted to share all of those, that those were very specific things and are still specific things that are supporting me as I'm navigating this dating journey. And I also want to acknowledge that one of the most common ableist microaggressions is not being seen or is not even being thought about of in the first place or is being excluded, you know. And I think that that becomes a core wound in some ways of what ends up what ends up showing up in dating. Uh, One thing I have personally had to learn is yes, I desire romantic partnership, but I want to check in with myself first to make sure I'm an eight, at least a seven or an 8 out of 10 excited about dating, or I'm going to take a break, right? If I'm a 6 and below, I need to take a break because who is going to show up in dating is going to be an exhausted, tired version of myself who is potentially jaded by dating or has had bad experiences in the past and is bringing that weight into a totally new person who doesn't have any of that context, right? So I personally just like to do the check-ins, and I started doing it on a scale out of 1 out of 10 because I feel like a yes or no can still have some weight to it. Like be a you can be a 6 out of 10 and that's still a yes, but that's not an 8 or a 9 out of 10 or a 10 out of 10. So yeah, I guess I just wanted to share a couple personal strategies that I use that hopefully may help some of your listeners as well.
That's great. I love that checking in with yourself, and which is some one of the core principles I teach when I'm working with people. Tiffany, I know we need to wrap up, so let me end with one more question. In your opinion, what needs to change in dating apps, social spaces, and societal attitudes to make dating truly more inclusive?
Mm. So that was three questions in one question. So let me start with the first, which is dating apps.
Yeah.
There is a fundamental flaw in dating apps, period, where you are making a decision on whether you want to date someone based on some photos and some prompts. And I know that there are some dating apps that have emerged that are catered more toward the disability community, but you're still not removing the flaw in itself is that you don't have a gauge for who a person is based on a couple pictures and a response to three prompts. That's why I'm a big fan, and this became popularized during the start of the pandemic, was like the virtual calls, or you would do like 3-minute dates. I think one app enables you to do that because there's a lot that can't be conveyed in a static, in asynchronous way that comes out potentially when you are in an IRL environment with someone, whether that's virtual or in person. And you can probably tell within the first 5 minutes of interacting with someone whether they're someone that you want to get along with. So I don't know how we fix that with the dating apps. I am someone who uses them but prefers to meet people in person. What is interesting as to why I still use the dating apps is that at my age, in my late 30s, it's a helpful way to know who is single, uh, because many of my friends are partnered. What was the second? So first was dating apps, and then the last was the next societal attitudes.
Social symbiosis.
Oh, social spaces. Ooh, social spaces. I mean, this really determines, and this could be a good exercise for you to determine where you feel you thrive the most in terms of showing who you are. So I will share an example that one time I proposed a comedy show for someone. I invited someone to join me at a comedy show for our first date. And they actually shared that they did not feel comfortable with that, which actually I will say I acknowledge I judged that a little bit. Um, but then I went on and I asked them, hey, what does an ideal first date scenario look like for you? And they said, oh, I prefer being in an environment where I can really get to know someone so that could be a coffee shop or going on a walk. Without like pressure. While for me, like I love the idea of a shared activity, like letting someone into my world, right? And so just knowing what are the ways that you feel like someone gets to know you best and ensuring that at least the first couple of interactions with that person are showcasing that. And then you learn more about each other's interests. We can have a broader conversation around social spaces and accessibility um, as well. And there are certain environments where maybe you go to a bar and it's really noisy there. And I remember actually the last longer term relationship that I had, I remember we met at a bar. I think they were showing like some sports game that night, and I could notice that he was visibly frustrated by how loud it was, right? So then we like relocated outside where it's a lot quieter, or he asked if we could be seated outside, right? So it's also like, okay, maybe you pick your favorite spot and the environment isn't what you want. Are there ways that you can again maybe assert whatever your access needs are in that particular scenario? And then societal attitudes. This is part of why I wrote my book, which is we have laws. I take the dating world out of it, but we have the Americans with Disabilities Act, but we still do have like a perception and attitudinal and societal gap around how we view disabled people, right? Societies is still actively devaluing disabled people, whether it's more subversive or more overt. And part of my book is how can we get those attitudes to catch up? And a lot of the work you're doing uh, in within the disability community and the work that all of us are doing externally outside of the disability community are hoping to close that perception gap a little bit more. And I will say that in the 16 years that I had been on my disability pride journey, in 2009, people had a really hard time grasping what it meant to be disabled and proud. Now you have mayoral proclamations or even state gubernatorial proclamations of Disability Pride Month. So it's starting to be more elevated in consciousness that we are here, we exist, and we've always been here. Part of why you haven't seen us for so long is ableism, is this not being seen, right? And we're here to say, we've always been here. And we're now finding each other much quicker, building community, and showing that we have power and influence together. So whether the pace is slower than we would like, uh, I have noticed a change in the amount of time that I've been, and I hope to play a small part in continuing to be a part of that change too.
Well, I would say that's a book I'm moving out for the YouTube audience. Definitely move to that needle in the right direction. Yeah, and it's a beautiful piece of work
Thank you so
that
much.
you have given us, Tiffany. Well, I could go on and on because I just love talking with you, but we do need to wrap it up. What is the best place people could contact you, follow you?
Yes. So if you go to my website, tiffanyyu.com, you will find links to all my social channels there. So you can follow me, whatever your favorite social channel is. And if you want to learn more about Diversability or join our community, we have a free Facebook group that is open to everyone. I think Radiant Abilities is part of it, or maybe
I
you're part of
believe
it.
yeah.
Uh, and you can also follow Diversability across social channels as well, too.
Okay, great. It has been wonderful talking to you. Thank you so much for sharing your insights with us.
Of course, thanks for having me, Kathy.
Okay.